like to introduce you to Doug Jones, who's going to give us a talk on crime and policing in the 19th and early 20th century. And I'm very grateful for Doug for doing this, because this is very much a last-minute thing. The speaker we did have organised, I think he's quite ill, isn't he, Doug? So Doug has actually stood in right at the last minute. So very grateful for him to doing it. So could you welcome him in the usual way, please?
I hope you can hear me. Can you? And can you see the screen well enough? Yeah? Thank you very much for coming. I would like to echo what Chris has said. I'm sure you could easily be sitting on the patio eating ice cream or walking up and down on the prom eating ice cream, but I'm grateful that you've decided to come and hear the talk. Really, I should say good afternoon to you all, but I think Dixon says it a lot better if you remember him, Dixon of Dock Green, right? I won't imitate him, just have a look at it. Can I just tell you what I would like to try to do? And I say try to do because it may be a bit difficult and it may not entirely succeed. But this is what I would like to do. I would like us to look at the present in terms of police as a mirror that reflecting the past, and the present as a window on the future. In other words, what I'd like to do is just say a little bit about policing now. Look at policing in the past, how it came about, how the new police, as they call it, was formed, and how those two things together, the past and the present, might open a window for us on the future of policing in this country. So perhaps if we can hold that as a theme, if you like, for the talk. And so let's begin then with the present. I think it's fair to say that we would consider policing, the police, the British police, to be essential in our society, to be pivotal in our society, and also to be constantly controversial in our society. No matter if we are thinking of the most senior police officer in the country or the most recent recruit to the police service, no matter whether they operate from very prestigious buildings or the most humble police station. That's the police station at the bottom there in Cowbridge, for example. No matter who they are, no matter where they operate from, we have the same expectations, and in our minds, I think, they occupy the same positions: essential, pivotal, and controversial. We place on them duties and expectations to enforce the law, to prevent, to detect, to prevent crime, to detect crime, to arrest suspects, to protect rights and liberties, to ensure our safety and our security, to be an emergency service, to do all that impartially and with integrity. And if they don't, then we complain in crowds, for example, we complain in a sense in volume, and we complain to, or the newspapers complain on our behalf. Our concerns are then that the modern day police operate in a balanced way, that if they're too powerful, we have problems. If they are too weak, we have problems. We like them to be polite. We like them to be helpful. We like them to use the right mixture of force and persuasion. We like them to be effective and efficient. We like them to have reasonable pay and reasonable conditions, but not too much pay and not too easy conditions. We like to see them. We like to feel that they're available. And we like them to be accountable. And we always raise the issue, don't we, of who guards the guards. So those are some of our expectations. And when they fall from grace, as it were, when they fail, as they appear to have failed in Hillsborough, where they appear to have failed in the case of Stephen Lawrence, where in North Yorkshire the Chief Constable did not pursue allegations of corruption among his senior colleagues, and when the police in Rotherham and elsewhere did not take up the complaints that were made by and on behalf of young people about abuse and associated activity, when they did not do that, we too complain about that. But all that apart, overall, we want to respect and we want to like the police. We say they police by consent. We say, or we like to think, that they are the people's friend. We like to like them, and they like to be liked. And very much, or very often, we trot out this phrase, the best in the world. Better, we say, than the German police, better, we say, than the police in France, or some aspects of the police in France, and better, we say, than the New York police. We don't have any real points of comparison, perhaps, but we like to think that our police are the best in the, as described by what I've just said. And one reason for that, perhaps, is that the police have become, or became, certainly, very much part of our television viewing, almost part of our folklore, if you like. And you remember some of those early programs, which are still being transmitted, in fact, in some cases. You remember PC-49, at least I remember PC-49 anyway, on the left there. And these will be familiar to you as well. And one reason for that is that if you remember those programs, the police, for whatever the tribulations, whatever the difficulties, they always emerge victorious, and they always emerge in a sympathetic way. They are sympathetic to us. We like them, in other words. So that's a very brief sketch of the modern police then. And what about crime? Crime in England and Wales. Crime statistics themselves are controversial. And because they are collected by two different agencies, they record, that is recorded crime that the police have recorded, and crime figures that are compiled from the crime survey for England and Wales. And that, I think, is by interviewing people and saying, have you been the victim of crime in the last year? And there are very often remarkable differences between the two sets of figures. But I think enough for us for the moment is to say that crime apparently reached its peak in about the mid-1990s with over 18, about 19 million crimes are recorded in the survey, far less in the police figures. But crime in both, by both reckoning, has declined, apparently declined quite significantly over the years, so that it is at a very low figure in 2014. But there is doubt about, in those figures, where either survey has taken into account computer crime and fraud. So crime, yes. Recording, yes. A drop, yes. But there are still some questions about the extent and the nature of crime. And Chris mentioned in his introduction Andrew's debates and the debate that will take place on Friday evening in the Y Centre, saying the motion is that there are too many people in prison in this country. Well, that is the latest figure. There are over 85,000, well over 85,000 people in jails in Britain. You see the law court, Cardiff Law Court there, and you can see Wandsworth Prison, and you can see Park Prison. And you can see how Wandsworth and Park differ, if only in terms of their building and probably in terms of their amenities as well. So there are a lot of people in prison too. And the other thing about police now is the way in which the police are managed and in which the public voice is expressed to the police via police commissioners. And the police commissioners there are on the top currently, and the current chief constables in Wales are at the bottom there. And you will see Alan Michael there on the top right, and he was a speaker, wasn't he, a few years ago at our study day. So a significant change then in accountability and in expressing the views of the people. And difference in method too. There is call, or there has been call, for a royal commission on the police. The last commission, royal commission, reported in 1962, I think. You will see the changes in methodology. Surveillance, you will see the equipment that a police officer carries, including now, in many cases, television cameras, personal television cameras. You will see at the bottom left there what I will call spies, if you like, policemen placed in among potential troublemakers, if I can put it that way, potential protesters, potential campaigners, and that has been much criticized. Terrorism, of course, is now a feature. Computer crime, very much hackers, surveillance, weaponry, and you can see how many people in the police service will spend their days looking at television screens that survey the whole of the police area. So many changes in methodology too then. So that's a glimpse of the present, a glimpse of the present. And what I'm trying to do then is look at the present as a mirror for reflecting the past. And we'll see how the past is reflected now, and how the present, and the present as a window on the future. So let's have a look at the past then, and our path through the past. We look at policing before the police, why the new police were formed, how the new police were formed, the attitudes to crime, disorder, and punishment in the 19th and early 20th century, the duties, the priorities, and the threats to the police discontent and challenges, police challenge to authority, if you like, technology, how technology came to the aid of the police, and finally, the reputation of the police in that period. So policing before the police. Well, we used to hear a lot in recent years about community policing. And this is community policing in the Middle Ages anyway. It was felt that it was the common responsibility of the family, of neighbors, of the community, that is tithings and hundreds, to ensure the safety, to ensure the probity, to ensure the conformity of members of those communities. It was a community responsibility then. And it was a community responsibility in the case of theft or damage to make reparations and to bring about conciliation between the wrongdoer and the victim. In the case of flight, well, if the wrongdoer tried to escape, well, there was the hue and cry, and it was then the responsibility of the able-bodied people in the community to pursue and to arrest that person. If they failed to do it, then the community had to compensate the victim. And if if the wrongdoer was apprehended and failed to appear in court, that person could be banished or indeed put to death. And the saying was, the person should be accounted as a wolf, so the person can be slayed as a wolf. So we're talking then about community responsibility and community activeness, if you like, actively preventing, compensating, and indeed, in some ways, punishing crime. And then, early in the 13th century and later in the 13th century, there was legislation which looked to the parishes to appoint constables to bring to justice, as it said, felons, miscreants, nuisances, drunks, and Sabbath breakers, to organize the hue and cry and to detain the accused. The later act, boroughs were required to appoint watchmen to guard and patrol under the supervision of constables. And watchmen were of mean estate, it was said, but in most cases honest men. So now you're beginning to get a body of people who are responsible for crime prevention within communities. Constables were people of some standing, appointed for 1 year without payment. Many people were reluctant to serve in that capacity because it interfered with their business and because they would lose friends by being constables. They were sometimes ridiculed and derided, but they had a bit of a boost later on from Oliver Cromwell, who used their existence, if you like, to justify his position. He said, "So far as I can, I am ready to serve you," that is the nation, "I'm ready to serve you not as a king, but as a good constable set to keep the peace of a parish. You couldn't have a better compliment than that, really, could you? Why the new police were formed then, right? So at the moment then, we are looking at a period before the new police. We are looking really at community policing. We are looking at constables and watchmen serving under them. Well, throughout this period, from, let's say, I guess the middle of the 18th century right through the 19th century, it was a period of huge social and economic change. We have a view of rural life, which is a settled life, we say, everything and everyone in its place. Something that is undisturbed, something that goes on from generation to generation. It was a hard life, but described as a hard but sufficient life, a life that people tolerated, people found generally acceptable. But there were changes. There were changes in the way land was managed and changes in the way land was acquired. Sometimes there were food shortages. There was a lot of migration and rural depopulation. There was the growth of industrialization and mechanization. And of course, allied to that, because of that, the growth of towns. And in the growth of towns brought with it, if you like, disease, squalor, destitution, crime, and disorder. Those idyllic pictures of the countryside there, or what appear to be idyllic pictures of the countryside there, perhaps underpin some of that thinking. Certainly the first part, a settled life, everything and everyone in their place. But was it like that? Work was hard in the countryside. You see the gleaners there, you see the road makers, the road menders, and you see that countryside. That's a stretch of Snowdonia, actually. And imagine farming that, for example. And people lived in poverty in the countryside, in hovels, in a cave even. I believe that's a cave at the bottom there. Very poor, and of course, I mentioned migration. People moving from the countryside into the towns. And the towns, the growing towns, encroaching on the countryside. And that's what the artists there are trying to convey, that the grime, if you like, of the new towns is encroaching physically and otherwise on the countryside. And we would be familiar, some of us, wouldn't we, with the two top pictures there. Certainly the one on the top right, mining, with all its noise, with all its dust, with all its steam, and so on, even on the surface. And there, the ironworks, I think at Merthyr, and you can see more of that. I won't delay too much on these things. And factory work, too, was not pleasant. You can see that at the top there. And quarry work was equally unpleasant. And here you have Thomas Carlyle writing about Merthyr. He said at the beginning of the 19th century, Merthyr was like a vision of hell. There were poor creatures broiling, all in sweat and dirt, among their furnaces and pits and rolling mills. And John Murray talked of Swansea, with smoking stacks, slag heaps, poisoned vegetation, Dante's vision of hell, he says. And then in these towns, you had travelers, people who were, if you like, people who were sellers, buyers, tradespeople. You had markets as well. And I could go on, and you can see more of them there. These people who wandered from town to town, selling, buying, making a living in some way or other. And then you had public unrest. The Gordon riots in 1780, which were against concessions to the Catholics. Food riots were widespread, Luddite uprisings. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819 in Manchester, I think it was Manchester, that was about the franchise. And the Cato Street Conspiracy, where a group of people tried to assassinate the cabinet when it was in session. So what you have then at this period, or in the early part of this period, in the early part of the 19th century, it was described as an age of criminality darker than any other, the golden age of gangsterism, crime the principal industry in many towns, street violence, armed robbery, theft, pickpockets, poaching gangs, drunkenness, widespread industrial unrest, and I've mentioned some of the places where that unrest took place. There were food riots, Scotch cattle. Well, Scotch cattle was a name given to really gangs of thugs who terrorized people who held views that they themselves didn't hold. The Merthyr Rising of 1831, in which 26 people were killed, and Dick Penderian, of course, was hanged. And the Rebecca riots in 1939, or between 1939 and 1843. And then the Chartists later, they were fired in Newport, for example, they were fired on, several were killed, and the leaders were deported. I think they were condemned to death, first of all, and then it was commuted to transportation. And there's a Chartist meeting in London in the 1840s, and you can see how well attended that was. And the Chartists, of course, were again asking for annual parliaments, secret ballots, universal franchise, and so on, and one-year parliaments, and the removal of the property clause, I think, for eligibility to vote. So you have then a very disturbed, a very unquiet society in Britain, or in England and Wales particularly. A very unquiet, a very disturbed community, a community or society very much in change and very much the victim of change, rebelling, being criminal, being rebellious, and so on, and being threatening, if you like. How were the new police formed then? Well, Henry and John Fielding, Henry Fielding, I think, is the novelist, two brothers, and John was blind. They were the first paid magistrates in London, and they formed the Bow Street Runners. And the Bow Street Runners would go and pick up people that the magistrates wanted to bring before them. And in addition to that, in London, special constables and more watchmen were appointed at around this period of the 1830 or early 18th century, early 19th century. The London Watch was increased to 280. They had better training. They were in uniform by 1828. There were more frequent and widespread use of troops, unfortunately. And much earlier, Major General Wolfe, had said that using troops to quell civilian dispute or civilian riot even was a dishonor to our arms. So as a serving soldier, he wasn't in favor of it. And what happened in 1798 was that these two men, Heriot and Colquhoun, together formed the Thames River Police. They did that because the pilfering, theft, stealing from the docks area of London was at a high level, and they wanted to counter that. So they formed the Thames River Police in 1798, and their motto was the first of all, and it's written there at the bottom of that badge, if you like. And then the formation of the Metropolitan Police. There had been several attempts to do this before 1829, or 1828, I think, when he brought the bill forward. The bill had been defeated, or the previous attempts had been defeated. But he was able to say, he was the Home Secretary at the time, and he was able to say that 55%, there was a 55% increase in crime over a relatively small period. That he wanted to bring order to the existing fragmented system of policing that we've described, to obviate the need to use the military to enforce new standards of public decency. Those who opposed him, and he was opposed vehemently, like the Earl of Dudley, who said, I would prefer half a dozen throats cut every 3 or 4 years to domiciliary visits, spies, and all the rest. They were very frightened of an official police service because I think they'd seen what was happening abroad, and they were very frightened that there would be that the police would be intrusive and punitive in that regard. But the bill was passed. The bill was passed in 1829. 2 commissioners of the Metropolitan Police were appointed, one a soldier, the other a barrister, and they were jointly responsible for the Metropolitan Police. First of all, they set out to recruit 1,000 policemen immediately, and they were deployed by the end of September 1829, very quickly. By the following May, there were 3,300. They were in uniform, but but the commissioners were at pains to emphasize in the dress of these police officers that they were not military. In other words, the uniform was in no way reminiscent of military uniforms. And you can see there the top hats and this kind of thing. They wore identification numbers. Their purpose was to prevent crime. They patrolled their beats at the speed of 3 or 2.5 miles an hour. And you keep doing that all day, and that's pretty tiring, right? They were to know their beat and to know the people of their beat. But they were not to have conversations with people. They were not to enter pubs, and on no account were they to drink alcohol when on duty. And then A few years later, 1835, there was the Municipal Corporations Act, which obliged boroughs to appoint watch committees to form and supervise a police force. Boroughs had no choice. They had to do that. Counties, the County Police Act in 1839 enabled counties to spend money to appoint a paid police force for all or for part of their area. And in Wales, this is what happened as a result of those acts. Denbigh, Montgomery and Glamorgan had county police forces by 1841, Carmarthen and Cardigan by 1844. Other counties that you see listed there appointed paid supervisors for parish constables, and some, I think, appointed them for part of their area as well. And they were all motivated by a fear of disorder, of sedition, of increased crime, vagrancy, and migration, as we've seen. And the first constable of Glamorgan, then. That's the advertisement for that position. He must be no older than 45, he must be medically fit, he must be in good health then, a sound constitution, and fitted to perform the duties of his office. He must not have been bankrupt, and he must be recommended as a person of good character and conduct. The interviews took place at Pile Inn, and some of us will remember Pile Inn before it was demolished. It must have been a very impressive coaching inn in its time, but when I remember it, it was dilapidated, and it looks a bit dilapidated there, but I think that's the quality of the photograph. But certainly that's where the interviews took place. There were 20 applicants, and Charles Napier, a captain in the Rifle Brigade, was appointed on the 11th of August. He started immediately. His salary seemed to me to be quite a good salary for those days, £300 and £150 for his horse and his expenses. He started immediately. He lived in Wenny Road to begin with, and then in Sarn Fawr. I'm not quite sure where Sarn Fawr is or was. I suspect it in the small village of Sarn near Aberkenfig, but I'm not certain. He divided the county into 4 districts, each under a superintendent. He recruited 34 constables, some of whom he made sergeants. The superintendents lodged with him, and the others in a wing of the recently built Bridgend workhouse, I think in Corella Road. There was military discipline, as you can see, in the sense of no smoking, rooms had to be clean and tidy, bedding folded, prompt for meals, and lights out by 10 o'clock. They were trained and deployed by November in that year. Under Napier, the force expanded from 34 to 200, and 16 new police stations were built. And there's a sketch of the first one in Bridgend. And there's a photograph of one of the first constables to serve under Napier. Well, Napier proved to be very competent and conscientious. He was courageous. In the Rebecca riots, he served on the local board of health. He was valued by the magistrates, but not accepted as one of them. He was not of their class, as it were. He craved acceptance for the sake of his family, and his son wanted to enter the church. And so he wanted to be accepted into that kind of society. But he failed. And his son didn't enter the church. He enlisted in the army and he was killed in Crimea at the age of 30. Echoes there, I think, echoes really of Rudyard Kipling. Kipling wanted his son to join the army, even though his son really wasn't medically fit. And his son did join the army in the First World War and was killed. So some echoes there. Napier's wife died in 1855, and his daughter married a labourer. And I don't quite know how Napier viewed that. But Napier died in office in 1867. And there's his tomb there in Newcastle Churchyard, or the churchyard of Newcastle Church in Bridgend. His successor was a very different character. There were 70 applicants for the post. The vast majority were former military officers. The press wanted two serving superintendents to be considered, praising them very highly. But 8 candidates were shortlisted. There was a committee of 83, would you believe, magistrates, and met in Bridgend in March. Some of them travelled to Bridgend by train chartered by Lord Tredegar. And the person who was appointed was a colonel, Colonel Henry Gore Lindsay, who just happened to be the son-in-law of Lord Tredegar. And he served for a long time, but he served very differently. He lived in Leckworth as a gentleman landowner. He seconded policemen for up to 3 years to work on his estate. He made rare visits to police stations, but when he did it with great pomp, in a horse and carriage, with footmen. He was looked upon with awe and reverence, indeed. He retired in 1890 and was succeeded by his son. So over that period of 96 years, his son served until 1937. So over that period of 36 years, there were only 3 chief constables of Glamorgan. Let's have a look quickly at attitudes to crime, disorder, and punishment during the 19th and earliest 20th century. This is a generalization, I think, but it's an indication, perhaps, of some attitudes. Wealth signified God's blessing, poverty, God's disapproval. The poor were naturally idle, it was said. They work only for bare necessities. Once they obtain these necessities, they become idle again. Drunkenness was considered to be the root of many sins. It was criminalized along with what was called illegitimacy and poaching. Property had to be protected and moral correction imposed. That's a generalization, but think about it. What is our attitude to the poor today? I've heard people say, what do you mean by poverty? How can people be poor if this, that, and the other, if they've got a television set, for example? So we're not entirely embracing the poor even today. And punishment, capital punishment was removed from some minor offences during this period or early in this period, and and transportation was ended in 1857. But of course, capital punishment remained for many offences, and imprisonment too for many offences. And I think that's an engraving by Daumier on the bottom left there of prisoners being exercised in a prison yard. I think there are many patios today which are bigger than that, aren't there? And the law was particularly harsh on the young. I've got a book which sets out in great detail how many children 11 to 13 who committed petty crimes of one kind and another, very small offences, were put into prison for up to 3 months, and then with hard labour, and that was followed by 4 or 5 years in a reformatory. And the idea was to reform. But you can imagine how harsh and punitive the reformatory would have been. And those are some of the children from Monmouthshire. I think that's Monmouth Jail up there, where they were put. And you can only shed a tear for those poor children. So the development and the extension of the role of the police. Well, the principle and practice of policing, they swore allegiance to the sovereign. They were there to prevent crime and disorder. They sought approval, respect, and cooperation. They were charged to be persuasive, to seek to give advice, and to warn. They used force, or they were to use force as a last resort. They were to be impartial and non-judgmental, and they were to be fair and vigilant. And vigilant. Their duties enforce decorum and the law on the streets, arrest offenders, gather and present evidence, curb the shame and sorrow of prostitution, supervise traffic and public houses, check premises, stop and search, inspect lodging houses, check weights and measures, assess entitlement to parish relief, supervise elections, list dog owners, inspect cattle, impound strays, supervise the sale of manure, confront poaching gangs, and enforce school attendance from 1870 onwards, when it became compulsory. You wonder what they did in their spare time, really, don't you? Right? Further political and social change throughout this period. Well, there was further migration, continual growth of towns. Swansea, by the 1890s, had a population of 65,000, Cardiff 70,000, Rhondda 88,000. Poverty continued and perhaps grew worse. There were continual industrial and political unrest. And here we're back to the streets again, living on the streets as a place to meet, the streets as a place to play, if you like. And here again, examples of poverty where workers waiting to be assigned jobs for the day. I think that may be a workhouse at the bottom there where men are living separate, of course, from their families. Riots, or strikes anyway, strikes in Merthyr, 1898, police escorting blacklegs in Tonypandy in 1910. The police themselves were the subject of violence and of ridicule. There's an example of violence on the left there, and an example of ridicule. Around the corner, there's a street fight going on. They're ignoring that, and they're arresting a lady with a baby. And that, of course, is Gilbert and Sullivan again, isn't it? You know the Gilbert and Sullivan Paul gendarme thing, and he picks that kind of thing up. And then, of course, there was violence of another kind in Britain, particularly not only in London. Fenian violence. The Fenians, of course, were a group of Irish radicals, I suppose you call them, who wanted home rule for Ireland, and they were prepared to, well, they were, I think we'd use the word terrorist now. There was an attack on Chester Castle in 1867. Again, in Clerkenwell, a bomb that they exploded killed 12 with 100 injuries. In 1880, they attempted to blow up Scotland Yard itself. There was Latvian anarchist violence. In 1909, I think what these people were doing were coming here, trying to gain money through crime. And in 1909, in a robbery, a policeman was killed and a schoolboy was killed. In 1911, there was a siege of Sydney Street, and there's a photograph of it there. Two things are interesting. The chap on the roof there just seems to be eating a sandwich. You can't see it from here, but he seemed, and what it is, the anarchists are holed up in a building further down the street. He's sitting there eating a sandwich, and in the front there of the police is Winston Churchill, who was Home Secretary. And he, of course, being Churchill, he wanted to be there and to lead, take charge of the whole operation. And what happened was that that 3 policemen were killed in that, and there was this underlying fear, as it was put, that the British race was being undermined by these foreign violence. And then the suffragette movement from 1906 to 1914. And I won't delay on that, but of course it was about the voting again, votes for women, and so on. The police response to all of that, to this subversive kind of activity, whether it was industrial riots or the kind of terrorism that we've just talked about, or indeed demonstrations like the suffragette movement. They had a secret, they were secretive and overt in their response. Napier, for example, when he was chief constable, had arranged dismissals of industrial radicals and advised on appointments of foremen to industrialists. The Metropolitan Police Special Branch was set up in 1880. Chief constables in Wales openly condemned what they called subversives and communists. Right? Then, in the 1921 miners' strike, homes were raided, which was quite unprecedented, really. In 1925, the Monmouthshire Police Committee voted to sack their chief constable for being overzealous in these matters. He remained in post somehow, and he dubbed them my little lot of communists. So there was open and there was subversive activity on the part of the police. In 1920, the police activity was coordinated. Chief constables and the Home Office drew up a plan to deal with the effects of general strikes. The police forces were obliged by law to assist each other. Civil commissioners were nominated. not actually appointed, but nominated in the case of great unrest. And this was said, the police service has a new and important role as an executive force, efficient, trustworthy, and steady. Trustworthy and ready to guide or restrain the civil population in a variety of ways. To guide and restrain the civil population in a number of ways. And then came the First World War. There were 10,000 resignations from the police service in England and Wales in 1914 of officers who wanted, or police officers who wanted to join the armed services. Specials were recruited. The police duties included then billeting, the arrest of deserters and absentees from the services, disturbances around camps, requisitions. They would requisition property, they would requisition some important things that would aid the war or the war effort. The protection of key installations, the arrest of aliens and undesirables, and the arrest of black marketeers. So they had war-specific duties as well, but they were weakened by the resignations, and perhaps the specials were less effective than their substantive counterparts. Then there was the Women's Police Service that was formed in 1915. 1,080 were recruited over the 6-year period. They were not sworn in, they had no powers of arrest, and they were said to be of a better class than the average policeman. After 1920, only 150 were retained, and whereas 53,000 policemen were serving. Police women dealt during their period of service, during the war, they dealt with women and children, the welfare and conduct of people working, or women working in factories, their facilities, the protection from chemicals, safety checks, and so on, and countering pilfering. Police content and challenge then over this whole period. Here is a policeman, Constable Evans of Kenfig Hill, appointed very early on in the history of the police service. He would be 26 years of age. He would earn 15 shillings a week. He had minimal literary skills. He was of the labouring class, as they put it. He would patrol up to 20 miles a day for 7 days of the week. He had to act with dignity and decorum on and off duty. He had to obey orders. He had to be punctual. He had to be reliable. What he read, if he read, that was monitored by senior officers. He had to get permission of senior officers to marry, and the woman that he wanted to marry would have been vetted, and his wife would have been expected to assist him without payment. The return was secure employment at a time of insecure employment in other walks of life. He had a uniform, he had boots, he had a rent allowance, he had a pension, and he probably had the respect of the community, or he tried to get the respect of the community. Those were the duties, those were the rewards. Over time, they developed what was called a craft consciousness. That is, that people belonged, the police belonged to something special, to a community within a community, if you like. The brotherhood of policing. A sense of self-worth developed, it is said. Confidence, assertiveness. But there were petitions for wage increases from as early as 1848. They complained about discipline, the harsh discipline. They were treated, they said, like schoolboys. There were, from time to time, mass resignations and protests. And the magazine, The Police Review, took up a lot of these issues. They championed individual cases, and they campaigned for the education and constant training of police personnel. Unionization, well, the Association of Chief Constables was formed in 1893. A police union was set up in 1914. In 1917, the authorities drafted into the services, into the armed services, police that they considered to be activists within this union. Union membership was banned in 1919. There was a Metropolitan Police strike that year, but also in that year, with government consent, with government approval, the Police Federation was formed. It was not affiliated to the TUC. It could not take industrial action. It had no influence on discipline or promotion. It was concerned only with police welfare. Even so, at the same time, there were substantial pay increases for the police and substantially improved pensions. Technology came to the aid of the police over the years, and you will see fingerprinting, a telegraph, cameras, phones, and so on. Also, the mobility of the police was increased from bicycles to motorcycles to cars. The reputation of the police, well, cost and effectiveness. Parish constables, it was said, were cheaper and just as good. This is in the early days. Just improve the old system, it was said. We don't want lads parading up and down, just parading up and down. The police will inevitably be invisible. We won't see them. They'll be a dull and sober reality. Police brutality was complained of. Calls for arms, to be armed by the police were refused. The cult of the physique was developed among many police serving officers. They wanted to be strong and fit so that they could combat anything that they came up against. They were accused of intemperate conduct. They were said to be an organized gang of ruffians in some cases, the bullseye of espionage, and the truncheon of persuasion, it was said about them. The murder of a policeman, in one instance, was said to be justifiable homicide. So they had their critics then over the years. But there was a discipline. Dismissal for personal shortcomings, for malicious prosecution, for bribery, for collusion with criminals, and vice rackets. Some of those things were detected, and of course they were punished. They were said to be biased. They were said to be the spies and the gamekeepers of the landed gentry at one point in their history. They said that chief constables were of the gentry class, and that was unacceptable to the majority of people. There was racial prejudice, it was said. They were quoted as saying, or some police were quoted as saying, that a demonstration or protest was led by the lower class of alien Jew. Later on in the period in the 1930s, many police were said to have sided with Oswald Mosley. And there was prejudice, it is said, against women police officers. And I think there was a lot of substance in that. Nevertheless, they gained respect too. It was said that they were very effective, criminality scattered in all directions. They had an uncanny moral authority. They were the pillars of society, it is said. British police better than all others, the greatest of its kind. They were effective, honest, moderate, and reliable. Two sides then of the argument. And probably the sides varied over time. And that is how the police would like to be considered, and that is how we would like the police to be considered in those photographs there. And in these photographs here, too, the caring, helping Bobby. And police and community work, well, the police, particularly in times of great distress, annual picnics, they ran youth clubs, they ran sports days, they raised funds for hospitals and orphans, they ran soup kitchens. And one senior officer said, for the police, running soup kitchens is a mere matter of duty, more important than the prevention and the repression of crime. And if you look at those poor children there, you can see perhaps what he means. And overall, perhaps one of the last things to say is that whatever we think of the police now, and whatever the police were thought of in the past, we cannot dispute this statement that was made in one of the London terrorist attacks some years ago. When we were running away from the disaster, the police and other emergency services were running towards it. And I think that's a very telling phrase. So let's finish then. The past and the present as a window on the future. The police were an outcome of an increasingly complex and troubled society. Think of our society now. Is it complex and is it troubled? Coping with social, political, industrial, and technological change. Are we now in a constant process of social, political, industrial, and technological change? Think of the advances in computer technology and computer-related technology, and think what effects all that may have on society, particularly in terms of employment, for example. Acting within and upholding the law, okay? Probity, accountability, and visibility. These were all obligations placed on the police from the beginning. Do they apply now, and will they apply in the future? In maintaining the balance between freedom and security. Think of that. Will that be an issue in the future? a civilian service with military duties. Think of what happened in recent terrorist attacks, where the police fired without hesitation on the perpetrators. Think of efficiency and proposed amalgamations of the police. Think of the police service in Scotland, for example, where there is one service for the whole of Scotland. And will the police, do we want our police to be of and for the people in future? All those things, I think, we need to consider for the future. If there is to be a royal commission on the police, as many ask for, maybe those are some of the things that that royal commission will take up. Maybe things have changed in many ways since 1829, but many things have stayed the same. And maybe the police can't stay the same, or maybe the police should stay the same, or maybe they shouldn't. But all that, I think, is for the future, and I would suggest to you that we can perhaps enrich our thinking about the future by looking at the present and looking at the past. So can I say, I would like to say thank you, but I let him say that, right? Thank you for listening. Mind how you go, and don't do anything I wouldn't do. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Doug. Has anybody got any questions for Doug? Malcolm.
Yeah.
Doug, you mentioned the fears that people had when the police service was being set up in the 19th century. Was one of the fears that they might be used as a sort of force to uphold a potential, say, dictatorship, which is why they were not set up on a national level, but were divided up into counties and cities? Yeah. Was that part of the thinking about that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that that's been said about the formation of the police in the early days was that they were really formed to maintain the status quo, right? And the status quo, of course, was everybody in their place, a sort of very rigid, if you like, social structure. There were allegations, whether or not during the miners' strike in the 1980s, where the police were accused, really, of doing the government's bidding, rather than simply maintaining order. So there's always a danger, I think, of that. Arguably, if there were, for example, a national police service, so I think there is not so much a national police service, but there is a service which has a national remit. I can't quite remember what it is now. But if there is, for example, a national police service, I guess the danger of being used by government is greater than a service that is currently divided into 43 local police services. You might argue that. But the great argument, the thing these days, is to lump things together, right? To make things bigger, because they talk about economy of scale, don't they? So I don't know. But there is certainly a danger of that happening. And there is too, if I could just say, I know we have to protect ourselves against terrorism. There's no question of that. But I don't know sometimes who's protecting us? These people who carry very sophisticated weapons and who shoot very accurately and who are very, very, very good at that, very quick reactions and so on. I wonder whether all of them are actually serving police officers, or whether some of them may be military people, right? I don't know. In a way, I don't care, right? But it's a question worth thinking about, because that too is an issue about how far you have a civilian service protecting the country and how far you have a military service protecting the country. So it's worth thinking about that. Not that I think we'll ever be told, but it's an issue. So yeah, I don't know whether I've answered your point, but yeah.
Are there any other questions?
I don't think it's a terribly subtle point that I'm about to make, but at some time, and I can't remember when, but in the last 15 or 20 years, maybe for political reasons or whatever, the police service became called the police service and not the police force.
Yes. That's an interesting point, actually. Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Doug. It was an absolutely fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Doug had reminded me how the social changes, from the Middle Ages on, really, was the genesis for producing the police force we've got today. Gilbert and Sullivan was mentioned. If I recall, it was a policeman's lot is not a happy one.
Yeah.
And if you are charged with supervising the sale of manure, I'm not at all surprised, I suppose. I think what Doug has managed to bring forward here is the incredibly difficult balancing act the police have got to do here. They've got to, in many ways, face two directions at once. They've got to ensure we have security, but on the other hand, they're charged with securing freedom. I don't quite know how you get that balance. The modern world we live in, there's been a lot of discussion now, encrypted emails. Terrorists, paedophiles, and that use this, so the police are after doing it. But of course, if they can get into a terrorist's encrypted email, they can get into yours. Now, this is an argument which is going to go on for quite some time, I think. Anyway, thank you very much, Doug. Very illuminating. Thank you very much. Could we thank Doug in the usual way, please?